Can everybody hear me okay? Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So starting off, just to do my name is Haley Hershenson, and I am the chair of the campus safety committee. And so that committee primarily works on mental health related advocacy, sexual and interpersonal violence, as well as drug and alcohol abuse. And in light of COVID-19, we're focusing primarily on mental health advocacy. And then Sneha, if you want to introduce yourself as well.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sneha. I'm the Vice Chair of Campus Safety, and I'm currently pursuing my MS in Biostats at SUNY Albany. And we have been working on mental health issues currently because I feel that's very important when it comes to COVID-19 and social isolation. So, yeah, looking forward for the workshop.
Great. Okay. So we wanted to start off by talking a little bit about why we feel mental health is important, especially during this time. So to start off, in case any of you don't know, May is Mental Health Awareness Month. And then also, just like I've said before, in light of this pandemic that we are all currently experiencing, the mental health needs of students has been exacerbated during this time. And I also wanted to make a point that it's important to remember that we are all going through this together. We're all experiencing the impact of COVID-19 in some way, shape, or form. And that's a message that can definitely be helpful to share with people, to let them know that whatever they're feeling and experiencing during this time, they're not the only ones experiencing it. But I also want to point out that there are, while it's important to acknowledge that we're all in this together, there's also some, very big inequities that existed before this crisis that impact the needs of students with regard to mental health. And so it's important not to kind of use that idea that we're all in this together to kind of minimize any impact that anybody might be feeling that may be different than yours. And so I just outline a few circumstances that I wanted to highlight that impact students' mental health and that are especially exacerbated during this time. Some of those are economic hardship that students are facing right now, food insecurity, access to resources, LGBTQ students who may not have a comfortable home environment or feel like they have a toxic home environment, who are no longer able to live on campus. And then also access to healthcare. It's been very clear in the news that people of color are disproportionately impacted by this virus because of inequitable healthcare. So all of these things are ways that students are impacted when it comes to their mental health that need to be considered. And so, Sneha, if you want to go ahead.
Sure. So, addressing mental health is important for college students' well being and success now and in the future. So, according to studies, by far the most common diagnoses are anxiety and depression with regards to college students, and there are also a fair number of adjustment disorders. When I say adjustment disorders, it means like people who are facing difficulty adjusting to either the freedom of college or to living in a dormitory or a residence hall or the amount of work that they have or balancing work and school.
Sorry.
And,
There we go. Okay.
and also research suggests that peer-to-peer resources are a very good start in addressing the mental health issues. And students are much more likely to talk to a friend or an RA about the problems they are facing rather than an administrator or someone who appears to be an administrator working at a counseling center. So, to start with, college staff working with peer to peer groups would be a good idea to help the students. And another idea would be colleges and universities may also partner with a local hospital or more general medical center that gives students access to certain professionals, such as psychiatrists, that a school may not be able to provide. So, while students may not always feel comfortable going to the counseling center, there are many ways colleges and universities can make these places as inviting and destigmatized as possible, with classes or relaxing areas for writing and reading. And peer to peer groups are always an open support system for students who are struggling but aren't ready to or don't want to go to the traditional counseling and therapy. And also there is an app called as the U Safe as could be a useful resource for SUNY students. So the app mainly has interactive preventive features like time to leave, expect me, sound the alarm, and age will drink. And it helps the students for instant access during emergency and provides resources on or near campuses and beyond. Yep.
And I just want to add a couple things to that. The peer-to-peer support is something that in a lot of our committee meetings we've talked about and heard from students that are um, on different campuses that that's something that's really worked well for them. And then it's also a good thing to advocate if your campus doesn't already have it, because we're currently in a time where resources and money, I think it's no surprise that it's limited during this time. So that peer-to-peer support is definitely something to lean on as a way to, even if your school is saying that they can't hire more mental health professionals, what are the ways that students can get more training or ability and access to be able to provide that support for each other or to gather in a peer support group type fashion. The school that I attend, SUNY New Paltz, we have a program called Oasis Haven, which students are able to manage a hotline to help provide that peer support for students. And that's something that's actually connected to a psychology course. So those students are able to get course credit, which is really amazing. I know one student on the committee also talked about at SUNY Albany, they had something called a Great Dane check-in, which is something that they created just for this pandemic, just because of the increased need for mental health during this time. And then I also wanted to add one point about the app that Sneha mentioned, which has resources for your specific school. I think it's really important um, to advertise not only the resources that your specific school has and the people that are hired there to support you, but also to find and do research and highlight the resources that are off campus. And that's something that's really great about this app. If you can find a way to incorporate it with your school, is that it talks about resources that are also near your campus for those students who may not feel quite comfortable seeking those resources on campus. And then the next couple of points that I have, just for local advocacy for your campus, is student representation on any mental health awareness or wellness committees at your school. So for example, the counseling center at your college might have an advisory committee. The student affairs department might have a committee specifically about wellness of students. Normally they will have something around the health and well-being of students, and people will get together and have conversations about different programs that can be started. The faculty governance structure might have some sort of committee. So the role that I have at New Paltz is Vice President of Academic Affairs and Governance, and I've seen our faculty create something called Supporting the Needs of Distressed Students. And that group of faculty comes together and they talk about how to support students' mental health within the classroom. And so I think that's a wonderful opportunity to try and figure out how you can get more students in the room for these conversations. And especially during this time when mental health need is increasing and students have a lot of different needs. And so if students can be a part of those conversations, even though they may now be virtual. And then the other thing that I wanted to add is if your school doesn't have anything like this, or if they don't have anything like this available for students to join and be a part of, then I would encourage you to go ahead and create one. At New Paltz, we had a senator who created and drafted legislation to create a wellness committee that could collaborate with our peer counseling center, which I think is really incredible. So if you don't see a structure in place where you feel like you can make the change that you want to see happen, then it's up to you to go ahead and figure out a way to do that. And then another point that I wanted to add in terms of advocacy is creating resource guides for students. So this is something that the Campus Safety Committee is working on for that can be geared towards all SUNY students and can be categorized in a way of if they're having a specific need that has to do with being a member of the LGBTQIA community, then they can have these resources that they can look for. And so that way it's not super intimidating to have to go and search for resources. Because if you can think back to an experience that you've had when you felt really overwhelmed and you felt like you needed to seek help, a lot of the times when we do, it can get really exhausting and draining if you have to search for that really hard. So I think creating resource guides for students is really helpful. And then, like I mentioned before, including resources that are outside of your school is also really helpful to give students a variety of options for what they can feel comfortable with. And then another point that I wanted to add, because this is something that I was working on at New Paltz, was creating this resource guide specifically for incoming students as well, because a lot of the times students will have first year orientation or transfer students will have orientation, and they'll get hit with so much information and they'll get hit with so many resources at once that it's hard to remember. And it's hard when you actually need to use that resource to be able to go back and find it. So one thing that I've been working on is creating a resource guide, and then also being really mindful about the language that is used when framing these types of resources. So I noticed that there are some, guides out there that frame resources by using the language, resources for victims of sexual assault and resources for victims of a crime. And I think one thing that may be helpful to make people feel more comfortable looking at these resources is if you were able to frame it in a language that is a bit more empowering. So using words like, resources for survivors of a crime, resources for survivors of domestic violence. I think it's really important to be super conscious when you're creating these guides for students. And then also categorizing them is a great way for people to just kind of get to those resources a bit easier. I don't know if Sneha, if you want to add anything at this point.
So, as Eli said, we should be mindful of the language when we talk with the survivors because they were like they've undergone something very severe, and I think we should do our best to help them.
Great. And then I don't know if anybody haven't been able to look at the chat. I don't know if anybody's been writing in the chat. If they have any questions that Sneha and I can address. I see someone brought up undocumented students. Thank you for bringing that up. Someone sent me a message. That's definitely one thing that we're considering in terms of categorizing resources.
Haley, you're getting a couple questions in the chat in this Zoom too, if you're able to see those.
Okay.
I can read them out loud if you can't see them.
Okay, I think I see one from Esther. Can you give some tips concerning if you are a friend or family member who notice someone suffering from mental health issues but are afraid to come forward? How can I convince that person to seek the help that they need? That's a really wonderful question. Yeah, so I think I'll start, and then Sneha, if you want to add anything to this. I think a couple of things that I would say for that is, if you notice a friend or a family member who seems to be struggling right now, I would say find ways to validate the ways that they're feeling, and find ways to, if you're feeling really secure in the place that you are in terms of your mental health, if you can find ways to kind of share that strength with them, I think it might be really helpful. And in terms of convincing the person to seek the help that they may need, I think it's really important to try and find ways to influence them to seek that support, but remember that you can't really control them or get them to that place, and they need to get to that place themselves. So, find ways to share resources with them without overwhelming them, I think is really important. Um, and so, I don't know, Sneha, do you have anything to add to that? I think that's a really great question, especially during this time.
Yeah, so I agree with Haley. So, what I would do is I would talk to that person one on one, and I would see what is comfortable, who that person is comfortable with, and I would approach that person to talk to them, and then I would and also one thing associated with mental health is that issue is that it is it it's usually stigmatized. People who undergo that problem, they think they don't feel comfortable to come out and go to the counselor. So I would first make them feel comfortable and um, explain them that there are many other people who have undergone this problem, and make them feel comfortable and help them to go to the counselor and psychologist.
Yeah, I would echo that. Whatever you can do to make them feel comfortable. And I would also try and, if you feel able to have a discussion with them about the ways that you see they're struggling, and if you're able to kind of point that out to them, because I think sometimes we may be really overwhelmed with a lot of heavy feelings, especially during this time, but we may not realize exactly how much it's affecting us. So I've definitely had friends and close people in my life, say to me, have you taken time for yourself today? Or, I noticed that you seem to be really overwhelmed. And it's not until somebody takes the time sometimes to ask me that question that I'm able to really stop and think, and recognize what I might be able to do moving forward. So any ways that you can find a language to talk about these things and to talk about mental health could be really helpful. Um, I see some other questions in the chat as well. Um, can you give any tips for people in unsafe situations, unable to live on campus? That's another really wonderful question, and something that's definitely really, really pressing during this time. Um, I would say, um, for that one, if you know people who are in that situation where they feel like they're in a toxic or unsafe environment, to help them create strategies for um, for how to manage all the things that they're feeling during that time. I think one of the hardest parts about this pandemic that we're all going through is all the uncertainty around this. So, I know a lot of students who are in this situation where they feel like they're in an unsafe environment. That's something that seems to be really exasperated by the fact that they don't know how long this is going to be. So it's one thing if there's a lot of students who already had um, you know difficulty managing their mental health at home before this pandemic started. Um, and so now it's kind of exacerbated when they're not sure when they can go back to campus or where they can go back to their to a living environment that they felt more comfortable with. But I would say if there are any ways that you can encourage people in this position to find strategies that can help them cope with these feelings, I would encourage them to seek professional help as well and counseling to talk about any safety concerns if they feel like they're life threatening or harming to them. But if there are ways that they can find coping strategies to get through this time because it's so uncertain, I would say, encouraging them to do that. So part of that may be setting boundaries for themselves with their family members. If there's a family member that they feel is unsafe interacting with, if they can set boundaries for, you know, um, having their own space at home, if there's any way that they can do that, I think that might be helpful. Sneha, is there anything you want to add to that?
No.
These are great questions. I see another question privately to me about where to find mental health hotlines and domestic violence resources. I'm so glad you asked this question because I'm working with some committee members for the Campus Safety Committee to compile a list of hotlines. And so hopefully we'll be able to get that out soon to folks. And then another great thing for that is, I don't know if any of you were able to tune in to the workshop yesterday with Elizabeth Brady and Joseph Storch, and they talked about a really, really great resource called SUNY Savior, which is a website that students can go to see different resources specifically for domestic violence, interpersonal violence, and sexual assault. And that platform has resources based on where they are, which is really wonderful. There's also, there's some really great functions for that because students can look at that resource, and then there's a safety function for that, which is really, really amazing, that they were conscious about, where you can exit out of that resource and that website platform, and then you won't be able to go back. So if you feel unsafe, at home, or if you're in a abusive relationship, then you won't have to worry about the person finding that you were trying to seek those resources, and that safety concern can kind of be eliminated. I also have, for the hotline question, I put the hotline for New York State, so you all can see. I also put a link on here for a website that's created, a student-centered website by SUNY that you can see right here. And it has some resources for mental health. And I wanted to share that with you all just because we're still working on compiling the list of resources and hotlines. But the hotline there is really great. It's, as it says, it's an emotional support line that's staffed by trained volunteers who can talk to folks specifically about how this pandemic is impacting their mental health. And then another great thing is that, that like a hotline could be a first step for somebody. So if you notice somebody struggling, just getting them to take that first step by calling a hotline, it's important that that's a great starting place for them to find other resources and talk through with somebody what might be the best resources for them. And so they won't have to go on that, wild search that I talked about earlier. Okay. And then I see someone wrote, that's so awesome that they have a list of resources specific for areas in New York. That's really awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And then I see there's another question about undocumented community. I think that's definitely really important. I think there are a lot of concerns within that community that are exacerbated, like some of the other communities that I mentioned as well. Also in terms of feeling safe in your community and feeling like you can, there can be some overlap between these communities, which I think is also really important to mention. When you think about intersectionality, oftentimes you can have students who are part of one community where they're feeling some very particular inequities, and then also be a part of another community. If a student is facing severe financial hardship or food insecurity, and they're also a part of a family that is facing a lot of concerns with being undocumented, that student is going to have a harder time seeking resources and feeling comfortable seeking support of their mental health. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind. So thank you for bringing that up. I see there's another question about self-care. I love talking about self-care. I think it's really important. And I think the way that self-care is framed is very personal. So we only have a couple of minutes left. So I will kind of try and wrap up and talk about a few of my main tips for self-care, and then Sneha, you can add anything as well. I would say first is try and kind of identify what self-care means to you and how it best fits for you. So I think a lot of the times we think of self-care as very broad and as very materialistic, but I think self-care can be simple, and I think it can be the smallest things that make the most impact. So thinking about self-care for myself is just thinking of ways to show up for myself each day, whether that be talking to a friend, whether that be taking a break to write, whether that be reading. So I think it can really start small. And I think the small things during this time of so much stress and feeling overwhelmed is really important. I don't know, Sneha, do you want to share your self-care tips? And then also anybody else in the chat, feel free to write what you do for self-care. I would love to see how everybody practices it.
So I would like tell about myself. What I do is the day before I plan for the next day, I make a to-do list of what I should do, and then I also do yoga and exercises when I get up in the morning, and then I make it a point to at least chat or talk to 2 to 3 people, maybe my family or friends, so that I feel good. And then whenever I feel low, I like cooking, so I cook a lot. So that makes me feel good. So and then watching movies and stuff, whatever you like, that makes you feel good. And I also wanted to share some resources. So, in one of the websites, I saw that there are various national groups such as Anxiety and Depression Association of America that provides extensive resources on their website and can talk to students or refer them to local therapist groups and medical help. And there are various available resources and organizations that help people with mental health issues, which are National Eating Disorders Association, American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, National Alliance on Mental Illness, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Institute, Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance, Attention Deficit Disorder Association, and Obsessive Compulsive Foundation. So there are various organizations that help people with mental health struggles. They also help students with mental health issues.
Awesome, thank you. And then I guess one last point that I want to mention is a shameless plug for the Campus Safety Committee. Our calls are every Sunday night at 8:30 p.m. And I also want to stress that the environment of this committee is very much kind of you are able to put in what you're able to, and folks on the committee are kind of able to work on what they're passionate about. So we kind of have a few separate topics that committee members are working on. So, if anybody here has any ideas for things that they want to see worked on in terms of mental health or sexual assault and interpersonal violence, feel free to tune into any of those calls. They're open, and if you want to reach out to me, feel free to do so. You can send me an email or send Sneha an email, and we will set it up so that you can join a call. And then one last thing I wanted to mention was that another project that the committee is working on is going to be compiling a video of support for SUNY students. So if anybody here wants to get involved in that and wants to be a part of creating that video, please let me know. I would love to have more faces and more representations. With that, thank you to everybody who joined. I appreciate it. And for everyone who participated in the chat.